Hey everybody, Brian Allred, teaching pastor at New Life Presbyterian Church in Yorktown. Welcome back to our series on learning to love Leviticus. We are now on the 11th lesson, and today we are going to be entering into a new section of the content of the book of Leviticus. You remember that we're working on a three-part outline here overall of the book in our attempt to learn to love the book of Leviticus. We looked first at understanding the context of Leviticus, and we looked at the redemptive as well as the literary context. But then we're moving on to the content of the book, which we divided into a number of sections. We've already looked at instructions for sacrifices in chapters 1 through 7, as well as instructions for the consecration of the priesthood, those who would be offering the sacrifices on behalf of the people in chapters 8 through 10. And today we're getting into the third major section of the book of Leviticus, and that has to do with instructions for purity in chapters 11 through 15. That will be followed by the Day of Atonement in chapter 16, and then instructions for holiness through most of the rest of the book, chapters 17 through 26, and just a brief epilogue in the final chapter of the book having to do with the fulfillment of vows or the fulfillment of dedication. And so today we're going to be beginning an overview on the instructions for purity. And that has to do with the duty of distinguishing. We looked at that a little bit actually in our last lesson right at the end when we looked at Leviticus chapter 10. And I mentioned that verses 10 and 11 of that chapter actually serve to set the trajectory for the entire rest of the book. They're kind of programmatic. Those verses. And just as a reminder, those verses in Leviticus 10, verses 10 and 11 say this. This is the Lord's words to Aaron and his sons after the death of Nadab and Abihu. He says, you, as the priests, they are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean. And you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them by Moses. And so we have here this introduction of the duty of distinguishing given to the priesthood. Specifically, they are given this task of distinguishing between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean. And the reason that this can be seen as programmatic for the rest of the book, or setting the trajectory for what follows in the entire rest of the book, is because what we have in chapters 17 through 27 is the task of distinguishing between the holy and the common. That's what basically we have in those chapters. The Lord is giving instructions to the people and to the priests as to how those distinctions are to be made. And you saw that that was one of the major sections that we have left to continue here in the book of Leviticus. But also in verses 11 through 15, the priests are given this task of distinguishing between the unclean and the clean. And that's where we're at in terms of our study of the content of Leviticus, looking at verses 11 through 15. So just an overview today, and probably we'll continue the overview in the next lesson as well. But let's try to understand what is being conveyed here by these categories of holy and common and unclean and clean. The first one mentioned is holy and common, although we don't begin with that in terms of the trajectory of the book. We don't get to actually those instructions until after the Day of Atonement in chapter 17. So we actually begin in kind of reverse order. It starts with making the distinction between clean and unclean and holy and common. But we're going to look at the holy first and then spend most of our time looking at clean and unclean as far as the overview is concerned. But we can say this about these Leviticus, the Levitical rituals that we see throughout the book. Rituals that we've already seen, actually. A main part of the first 7 chapters have to do with sacrificial rituals. And the Levitical rituals were aimed at 2 things, and we kind of see them here as they're outlined in chapter 10, verses 11, or verses 10 and 11 in chapter 10, setting this trajectory, that they're aimed at purifying or making clean, and they're aimed at sanctifying, or what we could say, making holy. Clean and holy. That's what these rituals are designed to accomplish by God appointing these things by His word in His grace for the people. A means to purify and a means to sanctify, to make clean and to make holy. And because clean and holy is what is required for the people to draw near to the holy living God who is now dwelling in their midst in the form of the tabernacle. He has established his dwelling in the midst of his people in the tabernacle. And so to draw near required the people to be clean, required the people to be holy. And so these rituals are given as an expression of God's grace to provide what the people need in order to live in the presence of God. And so let's look at holiness first, because it comes up first in verses 10 and 11, even though the unpacking of that in the book of Leviticus doesn't come until chapters 17 through 27. But what's the distinction to be made between holy and common? Another word for common, and you'll sometimes see this in translations, is to profane something. Now we tend to use profane with almost entirely really negative, strong connotations, using profanity, cursing. But the idea of profane is just to treat something as common. Something that shouldn't be treated as common is treated as common. And so that's this idea of the distinction between the holy and the common. Holy refers primarily to a status that is conferred upon people or perhaps upon things. But the basic idea of being holy or sanctified is to be set apart primarily for the sake of God, belonging to God, set apart for service to God, special kind of service to God. So we think about the holiness of the priests. They had been set apart from the rest of the people to a sacred task. Of course, Israel as a whole is regarded as a holy nation because they had been set apart from the nations around them as those people who belonged to the Lord in a distinct, special way by way of covenant. And so that's the idea of holiness. It's being set apart. Even when we talk about God's holiness, it's not so much that we're referring to God's moral purity, although it isn't necessarily invalid to use holiness as an attribute to refer to God's moral purity. But in its essence, God's holiness is something that pertains to all of his attributes because God is set apart from all of his creation as the creator. There's this distinction between creator and creation that makes God holy. He is separate from, other than his creation. He is holy. So when I said it's appropriate to apply holiness to all his other attributes, he's holy in his mercy. He's holy in his love. He's holy in his justice because God's justice is divine justice. It's not merely human justice. God's love is divine love, not in its essence human love. God's mercy is divine mercy. So it's other than, it's separate than, because it is the love, mercy, and justice of God himself. And so he's holy in all of his being and in all of his attributes. He is set apart from his creation. And within creation, certain things and certain people are set apart as belonging in a special way to God. I mentioned Israel already by way of the covenant. I mentioned the priests already. Those are people that are set apart as holy. We can think of somebody like Samson, who was a Nazirite, set apart with a Nazirite vow. This vow set him apart as holy. We can also think not just of people, but of holy spaces. Think of the tabernacle itself. Remember, we talked about the layout of the tabernacle. You have a courtyard, and then you have the holy place, and then the most holy place. So you have this assignment of sacred space, holy space, space that's set apart for a specific purpose as belonging to God. And of course, the most holy place is the place of his footstool, the Ark of the Covenant, the most intense place where the presence of God dwells in the midst of his people there behind the veil. So we can think about sacred space. We can think about sacred time as well. Later on in the book of Leviticus, in chapter 23, we're going to look at the Lord assigning all of these festivals for the people to remember and to celebrate. So that time is set apart. But even more basic than that, and even in that chapter, it starts out, chapter 23, with the most basic celebration and time to be set apart for the people. And that is the weekly Sabbath. And we read that earlier in Exodus chapter 20 with the Ten Commandments. And we're told there that we are to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Well, how is a day made holy? A day is made holy because it's set apart from the other days. And that's exactly what happens on a Sabbath day. It is a day that is set apart. So sacred people, sacred places, sacred time. These are all representative of holiness as opposed to common. Now, common doesn't necessarily mean that you're left in a sinful state. It just means that it has not been set apart for special divine purposes as something or someone that is holy has been. And so that's a distinction that the priests are required to make, distinguishing between the holy and the common or the profane. And it has to do with status. A status is conferred upon someone or something that God himself has set apart and declared as holy. And of course, being set apart as holy generally comes with certain duties and obligations to fulfill. And we can look at that a little bit later. But when we think about this distinction, we should keep these things in mind. What was holy could be profaned by people. In other words, it could be treated as common or vulgar. Vulgar is another word that we tend to associate with bad words, but vulgar again just means common. One example I could give of this in history is some of you may have heard of a Bible translation early on in the 5th century, actually early 5th century, that took the original languages of the scripture in Hebrew and Greek and translated them into Latin. This work was done by an early church father known as Jerome. And this translation into Latin was referred to, and it is referred to as the Vulgate. The Vulgate simply means it was translated into the common language of the people of the West, which was not Greek, it was Latin. And so actually this Vulgate translation was the primary translation that the Roman Catholic Church used throughout the Middle Ages. But the point here is it was called the Vulgate because it was placed in the language that was common to the people. It was in the common language. And so when we refer to something as vulgar or language that's vulgar, the root of that simply means that we're using common language as opposed to technical or sophisticated language. We're just using the language of the people, common to the people. But what was holy in a theological sense could be profaned by people, which means we would treat that which was holy as common or vulgar. And when this was done, it would lead to rejection by God. And it usually wasn't a rejection of what was holy. It was generally a rejection of the people who profaned what was holy. For example, the most common things in the scriptures that are profaned, that are holy, but are treated as common or profaned by the people, if you look at the Old Testament, the most common things are the Sabbath day. The Sabbath is profaned and treated as common, and the name of the Lord, which is holy, is treated as common. And of course, that's something, both of those things are items that we should consider by way of application when we think about this. The profaning of the Lord's day, treating it as common, and the profaning of the Lord's name, treating it as common, the way that we use the name of God, the way that we use the name of our Lord Jesus. Those would be continuing applications of setting those things apart, the words we use to talk about God, the way we treat days that he has set apart. We can treat those as common. And rather than God rejecting that which is common, of course, he's not going to reject the holiness of his name. But what happens is it leads to the rejection of the people who treat his name as common. And so what was holy could be profaned by people. That distinction was to be maintained, regarded, and upheld by the priests and by the people, and the priests were to guide the people into helping the people maintain that distinction between the holy and the common. Also, what was clean could become holy. And so we're dipping into the other category here of clean and unclean, but what was clean could be elevated to the status of holy through ritual sacrifice. In other words, it could be regarded as holy by the blood that the Lord had appointed to sanctify it. So by the sanctifying blood, something clean could be set apart and made holy unto the Lord. So they're not completely separate categories, clean, unclean, holy, common, because what was clean could become holy. However, what was unclean could not become holy. However, what was unclean could become clean, and once it was made clean, it could be elevated to the status of holiness. So I hope you're tracking with me there. But let's move on to then this category that's more immediate in terms of our unpacking of the content in Leviticus, because the distinction between the clean and unclean is what we find in chapters 11 through 15. And so clean and unclean refers to condition, not so much status, but a condition that someone or something finds himself or herself in. And it has primarily to do with the condition of one's fitness to appear in the divine presence. And what we're talking about here is the fitness to enter into the tabernacle precincts, into the courtyard, to draw near unto the Lord. That's what clean, unclean has to do with primarily here. It refers to condition. As I mentioned before, what was clean, well, I didn't actually mention this before. So first thing, what was clean could become unclean through contamination or pollution. Okay, so the clean could become unclean, but the unclean could also become clean through ritual cleansing. So again, what we said before, the aim of these Levitical rituals is to make clean what was unclean and to sanctify, to make holy. Again, to purify, to make clean, and to sanctify in order to make holy is what the Levitical rituals are aiming at doing. And so to go back to this concept, this is very important for us to understand because it can be easily missed by us by, I think, reading things into these terms that are not necessarily there with the connotations implied by the scriptures themselves. When we hear the words clean and unclean, we can think of filth and sinfulness, and that's not really what the Bible is getting at in its essence. Clean and unclean, again, refer basically to whether people were permitted into the sanctuary courtyard. They had to be in a condition that lacked corruption or pollution in very specific ways. So to be clean basically suggested health and wholeness. That would mean existing according to created purposes. That's what I mean there by wholeness. But to be clean suggested to be in a condition of healthiness or holiness or purity. Uncleanness obviously would suggest some kind of lack of wholeness. A little bit more about that in a second. But it was often viewed as being contagious as well. It could spread, and so it had to be isolated, it had to be contained, it had to be removed, had to be cleansed, or if cleansing wasn't possible except by a divine act of the Lord, for instance, in the case of leprosy, it had to be removed. And so this contagiousness of uncleanness is something that informs our understanding of what has to be done to things that are unclean. But cleansing, taking the unclean and making it clean, was viewed as a movement from death to life. But let's not read into that too much now. We'll get into this more in the next lesson, Lord willing. But we shouldn't look at this movement from death to life as meaning something equivalent to moving from sin to forgiveness. Because that's not the exact categories that we're dealing with here. There is some overlap, but the essence of these distinctions between clean and unclean is not a distinction between that which is sinful and that which isn't sinful. Okay, we're not dealing exactly with those kinds of categories. More to say about that in the next lesson. But still, cleansing is viewed as a movement from a condition of death, or having death cling to us in a state of uncleanness, to life, being moved from that pollution of death to cleanness. We can even think of the elements that are used in cleansing: water and blood, both of which speak of life, right? Leviticus is going to say that later, that the life is in the blood. Water is associated frequently with life. In fact, we can say that even physiologically, that most of our bodies are made up of water. And so water and blood, symbolic and reflective of life. And that's what's used in the cleansing ritual to reflect this movement from death to life, moving from unclean to clean. And of course, we see in this that this application of water, and specifically the application of blood, comes through the sacrifice that God himself has provided in his grace. And so cleansing is an act of God's grace that comes by faith. And so if I were to simply read that statement there on the PowerPoint slide, cleansing comes by God's grace through faith. And if I were to ask you, is that a truth that we learn from the Old Testament or a truth that we learn from the New Testament? The answer to that question would be yes. Cleansing comes by God's grace through faith. That's a truth that is proclaimed through the entire scriptures, Old Testament and New Testament. Of course, some differences there. And when we see this truth coming to us in the Old Testament, it's through these Levitical rituals. Cleansing through these Levitical rituals, through water and blood, comes by God's grace through the worshiper exercising faith in what God has appointed. Of course, the fulfillment of this is in the ministry of Jesus. And so when we think about the condition of being unclean, we could simply say this: the unclean are those who in some way have an aura of death about them, an aura of death about them, in that they manifest less than physical wholeness. When we get into these chapters that unpack these conditions of uncleanness, the requirement for purification after childbirth, bodily discharges, leprosy, diseases in the structures of the home, physical structures, material structures of the home, we'll see that there's this aura of unwholeness, or an aura of death about these conditions in which there is less than physical wholeness that's being manifested. And before the worshiper can draw near to the Lord in the tabernacle courtyard, there has to be a ritual of cleansing. The unclean have to be made clean. This aura of death can be seen in a couple passages. If you look in Leviticus chapter 13, just to stay in this book, Leviticus 13 verses 45 and 46 has to do with instructions about leprous people. The leprous person who has the disease of leprosy, shall wear torn clothes, and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. Now listen to these specific instructions. He shall live alone, and his dwelling shall be outside the camp. He is isolated from the community. He is outside the camp, meaning outside the camp of the tabernacle, removed from the precincts, removed from God's presence. Remember, to be outside of the presence of the living God is to live in death. And so there's this aura of death about leprosy. And in what's required of the leper, there is this reflection of this aura of death in it. We read this also in the book of Numbers. This is the occasion following when Aaron and Miriam actually contend with Moses and his leadership, and the Lord strikes Miriam with leprosy. And Aaron pleads on behalf of Miriam to Moses, and he says in Numbers chapter 12, "Oh my Lord, do not," he's speaking to Moses here, "Oh my Lord, do not punish us because we have done foolishly and have sinned." This is a reference to their contending with Moses' leadership. And then he pleads on behalf of Miriam by saying, "Let her not be as one dead, whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes out of his mother's womb." A rather vivid kind of verse there, but I'm sharing it because of that language of let her not be as one dead. To be suffering from leprosy and to be removed from the camp is to be treated in a way that is consistent with death, being removed from the presence of the living God. And so to be unclean is to have this kind of aura of death, and to be unclean is to have this aura of death. But cleansing is a movement from that condition, from death to life. But again, we shouldn't confuse that with making unclean and sinful synonymous. Something very important that we're going to look at in the next lesson. The term unclean must not be interpreted to mean sinful. They are different. There's some overlap, but they need to be distinguished by us as interpreters of the scriptures, as well as the priests are doing their duty of distinguishing the holy from the common and the clean from the unclean. And so we're going to pick this back up in our next lesson. So hopefully you'll join us then.